with that, I would like to pass it on to Dr. Micah Russell, who's our Director of the Integrative and Public Land Management Master's Program here at Western. We're incredibly grateful to have him coming to us from University of Idaho. Welcome to your first Headwaters, Micah.
Yeah, thank you, John. It's a real privilege to be here. And I'm honored to be asked to host our conversation this morning. We have a couple of really outstanding guests who are going to take us on a journey that stems from the conversation last night quite naturally. So Ashley Perl with the City of Aspen is going to be speaking to us about community climate action planning on the ground level in the community she lives in, what it looked like in the past and what we can expect in the future. And then Dr. Michael Mendez will take us forward from there, looking at some case studies from California and the dialogue that's beginning to happen more and more between local actors and global actors when it comes to climate action planning. And just to whet your appetite, I'm going to read a very short passage from Michael's book, and this sets the stage for the conversation to come. I hope that's okay, Michael. Environmental justice advocates have stressed that inequalities within California made linking local equity concerns with state-level climate policy design are especially important. They argue that there is additional pressure on policymakers to ensure that climate change solutions provide multiple benefits and prioritize communities living next to large polluters. He goes on to write that what was once a movement to responding to site-specific hazards has started to engage in a much broader and proactive approach at the state level. In addressing climate policy, the environmental justice movement is seeking changes on issues that have typically been the exclusive domain of traditional environmental organizations. California's environmental justice movement is therefore becoming a sophisticated and key political constituency. So these are exciting times to be having this conversation, and of course it feels rather urgent because we're all feeling some aspect of climate change on our doorstep. It's no longer abstract, it's no longer a conversation around the poles of our planet, but rather it's in our communities, it's in our cities, it's on our streets. And so this is a very timely and urgent conversation. With that, I'm going to introduce Ashley Perl. Ashley Perl was born and raised in Aspen and now serves as the City of Aspen's Climate Action Manager. Ashley has served the community of Aspen for 13 years by creating and implementing environmental and social sustainability projects of all types. This includes starting the first food waste composting program in Aspen, introducing the plastic bag ban in grocery stores, and helping Aspen Electric achieve 100% renewable energy. Quite a feat. Ashley also serves on the board of directors for the Community Office for Resource Efficiency and the Alfred A. Braun Hut System. You can usually find her in the mountains playing or on rivers with her two young boys, her husband and her dog. What a pleasure, Ashley. Thank you for being here. We look forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Micah. I'm going to share my screen if that's allowed here. Let me see. Oh, yes. Look at that. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on a Saturday morning at 9 a.m. and especially to Mike, who's quite a bit earlier, at least an hour. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today and just really engaging with the Western community. We've worked with Abel Chavez before and his team, and we've had some really great partnerships between the City of Aspen and Western, so it continues. Before I get started, I have to fully disclose that when I was first invited to participate this morning, and I heard that we were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in climate action planning, I said, thanks, but no thanks. You don't want me. And this is because, the City of Aspen has been working in climate change for 2 decades now, but this is such a constantly changing field. And I feel that right now, the imperative on local government officials and anyone doing climate action planning is to really lead with equity and with race considerations. And full disclosure, the City of Aspen has been a leader in climate action planning, but we are far from a leader in this new phase of climate action planning. So I feel like I'll share with you today kind of a history and where we've been, but I am in the nascent stages of what this next phase of climate action planning looks like. And so I'm really looking forward to learning from everybody, but I do really know that this is where we need to go. You know, climate planning and addressing climate change is such a complex problem, and it affects every single person living on this planet, but it affects every single person living on this planet in different ways, and not equally. And we know that people of color, refugees, immigrants, our low-income populations are most heavily impacted by the changes that global warming brings. And those populations as well typically have the fewest amount of resources to adapt and change and be resilient to those impacts of climate change. So as a local government official, I feel it is imperative, it is in my day-to-day responsibility to be addressing climate action, or to be doing climate action, addressing climate change, but I have to do that involving every single member of my community and in a way that serves every single member of my community, not just equally, but equitably. So that's really my focus moving into this next decade. We're moving into 3 decades here of climate action in Aspen. And like I said, I'm a beginner here, so I'm looking to learn. So that being said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about why climate action is important in Aspen, Aspen's history in this field, what we've done in climate action planning, and then our next steps. And then I'll turn it over to Mike, and I'm really excited to hear about next steps, and where this field is going, because we all need to learn together. So I'll start a little bit here with some data. So this is a graph, this is a weather station that's located right by the Aspen Valley Hospital. And we've been tracking something that we call frost-free days. We've been tracking it since 1940. So frost-free days are 24-hour periods when it doesn't freeze. So this is really striking data. It's local. And so if you look at climate change data across the globe, that's one thing. But to see that in Aspen since 1980, we have had 31 more frost-free days. That's since 1980. Not since we started measuring, but since 1980. So in just about my lifetime, we see 31 fewer days of winter is what this data means. So why do we care? Less winter sounds kind of nice, more fall maybe, but no. We care deeply as mountain communities about winter and about freezing temperatures for a couple different reasons. In November, we really want to be able to make snow so that we can start our ski season off well and have a strong economy moving into the winter. Frozen temperatures are required to make snow. We want frozen temperatures in April and May so that we can keep snow on the mountains, not just for skiing, but for our rivers. Typically, runoff in Colorado is the first week in July. If we start to see snow melting in April instead of May or June, then we're going to start to see runoff move quite a bit sooner. And then when we get to this time of year, September, October, there's not going to be water in the rivers, and we're still in fire season. So we really need those long extended winters to keep snow and to keep with our traditional runoff cycle. Also for our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our homes, our roofs, they're all built to withstand constant freezing temperatures in the winter. They're not built to withstand melt freeze cycles. Here at the city of Aspen, we maintain all the roads and bridges. And a couple of years ago, we were seeing so many melt freeze cycles that created a ton of potholes that we actually had to double the budget that we allocated towards winter road repair, because by the end of January, we had blown through our entire budget for the entire year for road repair because we were seeing so much melt freeze and so many potholes. We're also getting a ton of calls from residents who had never had their roof leak before, but were experiencing a ton of ice dams because of melt freeze. So it's an infrastructure problem as well. And then lastly, but certainly not least important, is our ecosystems. You know, I have a picture here of beetle pine kill over in Summit County. And our trees and our ecosystems are accustomed to long, cold, hard winters where you don't see melt freeze. And that actually shores up the trees to be able to fight off disease and insects. And so if our trees are also experiencing this melt freeze, then when the bugs show up in the spring, they're really not insulated and hardened to fight off these diseases. And then we see the beetle kill type of event that we've been seeing across Colorado. So when I look at the data, when I see that there's 31 more frost-free days, 31 fewer days of winter in Aspen, that tells me that climate change is happening, it's impacting us, and it's impacting a lot of things that we care about deeply as a community. And this is true for all mountain towns across Colorado. So, we're all in this together. So what's Aspen doing about it? This is kind of our timeline through climate action. So we started this work in the year 2000. Our city attorney at the time heard of this thing called global warming, and he said, I wonder what that is, and do we care? And so he learned some things. He brought forward this idea, and he said, I think that global warming is going to be a big deal. We should probably understand what Aspen's impact is going to be. So we started our first greenhouse gas inventory. It took us 3 years to create a greenhouse gas inventory. This seems crazy in today's world because you can create a greenhouse gas inventory maybe in a week if you have the right data. But at the time, very few cities were creating these inventories. And so we started from scratch. We didn't know the protocols. There weren't institutions out there telling us how to do this. So it took us a while to figure out how we should appropriately measure Aspen's greenhouse gas footprint. So we did that. That's our first one. And then we asked the second question, which is, okay, we know what our footprint is, but how is climate change impacting Aspen? So we created this vulnerability assessment. This looks at all the different sectors in Aspen that we care about, and it projects what we're expecting to see in 20, 30, 50 years, and how climate change is going to impact Aspen. So we had the question answered, what's our footprint? And then we had, what's the impact on us? So then we moved to a climate action plan. What are we going to do about it? So we created Aspen's first climate action plan in 2007. This was right around the time where a lot of cities, big cities, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, were really starting climate action planning. So we were one of the only small cities doing this work at the time. So this is basically just a listing of actions that somebody should take on at some point to address climate change. So, our first climate action plan was basically a bulleted list of, hey, here's some ideas. Since then, we've gone in and we've really updated our climate action plan. So in 2018, we published Aspen's Climate Action Roadmap, and that's really been our guiding document since. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit about what's in there, because I think it is a good resource. So the way that we created this was a bit more inclusive than just creating that bulleted list that we did back in 2007, but it's not inclusive by today's standards, so we have a long way to go. But what we did is we had a 40-person advisory committee that had a number of representatives from across the community. They really told us what should be in this climate action plan. We also did quite a bit of data and modeling and forecasting, and we worked with Abel Chavez and the team at Western to do a lot of that, because we didn't want to have a climate action plan that said, okay, here's everything you should do, but by the way, we don't know if it'll get us to our goals. So we wanted to make sure that if we put out a climate action plan, we had measured and forecasted, and we understood that if we did everything in the plan, we would get to where we wanted to be. And then we also included the public, the community members, and local businesses, and we surveyed them and we asked them, what do you want to see in your climate action plan? What are you willing to do? What's the feasibility of some of these actions? So what that did is it created, what you'll see on the right is Aspen's Climate Action Plan. It has 46 actions, and it's really an implementation plan. At the same time, we had gone through all this work. That whole process I told you about took 1.5 years and about $30,000. So not a short timeline and not a cheap endeavor. And what we found is that we had all this really meaty, good stuff that didn't make it into our climate action plan. And we said, there's got to be a use for this. So what we did is we created the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Toolkit. So this is 250 actions. And what it's really intended for is other communities. So it's supposed to be a shortcut for climate action planning. Because like I said, 1.5 years and $30,000 later is not an option for most communities across the nation, nor should it be. If we have an imperative to address climate change, and you as a city or a local government need to spend 1 year just making the plan before you can do anything about it, it's not going to get us to where we need to be. So we created the toolkit as a resource for other communities so that they can just pick this up, choose some actions out of it, and get going on the action part of climate action. So this is kind of the role that Aspen plays, is always trying to be a resource for other cities, because we recognize we have a lot of resources and we want to make sure we share those. So in the climate action plan, we address 6 sectors. That's energy supply. So where does our power come from? What's the carbon intensity of our power? Residential energy, commercial energy, vehicles and transportation, that's anything on the roads, waste in the landfill, and then aviation and airport. So I just want to walk you through what's in the Climate Action Plan in case you ever need to go there or see what's in there. So it starts with an objective. So this is replace natural gas heating and appliances with electric or renewable systems. Then it goes on to have actions, the different actions you would need to do to reach that objective. For every action, we have an estimated greenhouse gas reduction potential. And then this is the piece that I really like and then I want to build on for our next iteration. We have a section called co-benefits. So this is where we outline, would this action promote equity? Would it foster economic sustainability? Would it improve local environmental quality, enhance public health and safety, or build resilience? So this was our first step at trying to think about the co-benefits of greenhouse gas reductions. And I just feel so strongly that if I'm running a program that does nothing but reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's not the right program for our community. We have to be delivering co-benefits and other services to our community through any program that we do, because it's such an important time to be addressing all of these other items that if you're putting a lot of money and time solely into greenhouse gas emission reduction, it's a missed opportunity. And then we also have these kind of blank spaces where we put the time frame and the partners that we'll be working with on this project. In the Climate Action Plan, there's 46 actions. There's 25 of those in progress right now, currently in our community, which means that there's 65 unique projects or programs going on to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deliver those other co-benefits. So as you can see, Climate Action Plan might sound simple from the beginning. Let's just make a list of what we're going to do. But it pretty quickly becomes quite a number of full-time jobs and a full-time focus. So that's kind of how that plays out. So where are we? What have we done? So you can see here our 2004 greenhouse gas emissions inventory was our baseline. It's a best practice to do these every 3 years. So we've tried to stay a little bit on that schedule. So you can see we did one in 2007, 2011, 2014, and 2017. In general, our greenhouse gas emissions in Aspen have been on the downward trend. Last we measured in 2017, we were down 20%. Our goal is to get down 30% by the end of this year, by the end of 2020. So this is a really big milestone year for us, as well as for cities across the world. Those cities that initially started working on this typically had goals of 30% reduction by 2020 and 80% reduction by 2050. So Aspen is joined by a couple hundred cities who will be reaching their first milestone year in 2020 and doing this big measurement initiative to see if we've met that interim goal. So we're hoping to get to 30% down by the end of this year. I think with COVID and the pandemic, we will certainly get there, but this brings up an interesting question of, is the 2020 data not valid? I mean, of course it's going to be valid, but how are we going to use that to inform our future planning? Let's say we're down 40%. I don't really want to throw a community party for other reasons, but it's not necessarily indicative of the trajectory that we're on, because when we do come back to some normalcy someday, hopefully, our emissions are going to skyrocket back up. So we really need to account for that in our planning. So this is the measurement that we do, kind of the back end of the Climate Action Plan. And so this tells us, where do we go from here? So these are kind of the next steps that we've identified. We understand that to get to the 20% reduction, we did all the low-hanging fruit. We changed out light bulbs, we increased efficiency. We have a tremendous bus system in Aspen. Those were not easy things, but they were the basic things. If we want to get to 80% by 2050, we need significantly more impact to reach those goals. We also realize that we have to focus on both supply and demand. So we have to make sure that our grid and our fuels are as green or as efficient, as low carbon as possible. But we also have to focus on the demand side, because there's some fuels that we're not going to be able to switch over in the time that we need to. So supply and demand are both really necessary. Federal and state policy is essential. So the city of Aspen, along with a number of other cities in the state of Colorado, participate in an organization called CC4CA, the Colorado Communities for Climate Action. This is a group of local governments that want to make sure that their climate and energy interests are represented at the state level. So we have a lobbyist team that works really hard during the legislative session to make sure that climate and energy are on the front the forefront of legislative matters at the state. This is essential because we can only do so much as local governments, and we need that enabling legislation at the state, or we need to make sure that there's not preventative legislation stopping us from doing these local actions. And then lastly, we have to start focusing on systems change. If we make Aspen, just within our little city limits, carbon neutral tomorrow, it's not going to make a lick of difference on the global scale, right? But if the Roaring Fork Valley, and then the Gunnison Valley, and then the Eagle Valley, and then we can all do that, well, now we're getting somewhere. So we have to make sure that we're working on regional change as well as across sectors. We can't just say, okay, we have electric buses in the transportation system, we're good. We have to look at the watershed, the travel shed, the air shed, and make sure that we're addressing it across these regional and larger settings. So these are kind of the next steps for Aspen as we saw them in our little bubble. But what I'll say is that truly the next step for Aspen is to figure out how we incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion and considerations of race into our climate action plan. I put up the USDN logo here because I have to give a shout out to them. USDN is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. It's about 300 folks who have my job across the US and Canada. We are a really active network that supports each other in our learnings. What USDN has done over the last 5 years is taught us as sustainability directors that equity and inclusion is an essential value that we must be including in all of our environmental sustainability work across the board. So I will say that USDN is leading in this space as far as local governments are concerned, and they are the ones that are truly pushing us as the city of Aspen to really consider diversity, equity, inclusion in everything we do. And they provide trainings for our staff and a lot of research and writings and tools to do this. So we're definitely getting quite a bit of pressure from other peer cities, which is great because talking about diversity, equity, inclusion in a small mountain town like Aspen turns out is much harder than anyone anticipated. And so we need a lot of help in this space, but this is where I want to move is our next climate action plan, which we need to start working on next year, has to be dramatically different than our current one. It needs to have so many more voices at the table. It needs to call out policies and underlying structures that are inequitable and make sure that we are addressing those in anything we do. And so that's what I want to learn about. And that's where I'm just absorbing as much information as I can possibly get these days. And I think that's a great turnover to Mike, because hopefully he's just going to solve all these problems for me and tell me what my next climate action plan should look like. So that kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. So here's a old school video or an old school photo from Aspen and my email address, which I'm sure you can get from Micah, because I'm happy to always answer questions and engage with anyone. So that's all from me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashley. I'm sure you can imagine the applause. That's really helpful and sets the stage for the conversation to come. I'm going to remind the audience that the format today is we're going to move through both speakers, then we're going to take a short pause so that we can send all the students into Zoom breakout rooms to generate really compelling questions. We'll come back with those questions for some Q&A at the end. So hold on to those thoughts for now, and let's have Dr. Michael Mendez take it away from here.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, John.
Excuse me. Michael, I forgot to introduce you with your bio. So my apologies. Let's take a moment for that. Dr. Michael Mendez is an assistant professor of environmental planning and policy at the University of California, Irvine. He most recently served as the inaugural James and Mary Pinchot Faculty Fellow in Sustainability Studies at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He has more than a decade of senior level experience in the public and private sectors where he consulted and actively engaged in the policymaking process. This includes working for the California State Legislature as a senior consultant, lobbyist, gubernatorial appointee, and as vice chair of the Sacramento City Planning Commission. There is a lot more, of course. If you are interested in seeing his many contributions as a scholar and as someone who participates in policymaking and as an author, I encourage you to go to his website and check it out. So thank you, Michael. Take it away.
Thank you, Micah, and thank you, John, for the invitation to this great and innovative and progressive conference on climate action and the issues of inclusiveness and equity and diversity in our environmental movement. And thank you, Ashley, for the great work that you're doing in the city of Aspen and pushing the city forward as a strong environmental leader, and now challenging the city to address some equity concerns. One of my colleagues and my mentor, David Pello, wrote a great book about Aspen that you may be familiar with, The Slums of Aspen, that really looked at these issues of environmental privilege and how it affects some of the migrant communities in the area. So I recommend you reading that, because that's a historical view of where Aspen has been previously, and now the great work that Ashley is doing to move the city forward. So thank you for that. And as Ashley talked about, there's a strong environmental imperative, and as well as an economic imperative, to have a more sustainable society to address the challenges of climate change. But there also needs to be a justice imperative. And how do we do anti-racist climate action policy and include more issues of diversity and inclusion in our process? In California, I'm talking from California, where we're at the forefront, along with Washington, Oregon, and even Colorado, for some of these climate change, and understanding that we are in a climate emergency, that climate change is real, that these wildfires, the compounding disasters, wildfires, heat waves, drought, extreme weather events are all happening together simultaneously in places like California, and they're more likely to happen now because of human-caused climate change. And the communities being hardest hit, of course, are low-income communities of color. And to integrate environmental justice or an anti-racist policy within climate change is quite challenging. And I actually talked about sort of the challenges that are facing the city. In my book, I specifically talk and center my analysis on those conflicts around how low-income people of color try to engage with policymakers and mainstream environmental groups or traditional environmental groups to have a more realistic view of what climate change and environmental degradation meant to them, to their human bodies, and to their local communities. So I'm going to share my screen and provide a very high-level overview of the history of these conflicts and sort of the theoretical frameworks or positionalities that environmental justice activists bring to their work. Okay. The climate crisis and pollution from fossil fuel combustion are a public health emergency, as I mentioned, and the impacts disproportionately affect people of color. Blacks and Latinos are particularly vulnerable to climate-related threats due to historic sightings of fossil fuel operations in communities of color. In a recent opinion piece, Diane Tekavorian, she's a California environmental justice activist in San Diego, argued that since we have known about these environmental risks for decades, non-action is explicitly racist. So in my new book, Climate Change from the Streets, where we see the book cover here, I tell an urgent and timely story of the contentious politics of incorporating environmental justice into global climate change policy. I explore the contentious nature of efforts to define climate change as a public concern and how interaction of diverse kinds of knowledge and worldviews, as well as power and racial dynamics, shape contemporary climate governance and decision-making processes. In essence, my book is about people, place, and power in the context of climate change and inequality. Although the science about climate change is clear, policy decisions about how to respond to its effects remain contentious. Even when such decisions are claimed to be guided by objective knowledge, they are made and implemented through political institutions and relationships, and all the competing interests and power and racial struggles that this implies. California is often seen as a homogeneous entity that uniformly values environmentalism and climate action. This image, however, universalizes the idea of climate change and detaches it from its cultural settings. It also obscures how the localization of environmental policy and science within the state involves processes of public consultation and legitimacy. So using the example of California, my book examines the culturally contingent nature of climate policy, the assumptions and worldviews that often create conflict between community understandings of local environmental conditions and the prevailing global regulatory culture of climate change. I argue that through a recurring process of conflict and collaboration, a broad range of individuals and organizations are co-producing what climate change and environmental justice means. For environmental justice activists, the main threat from climate change is a disproportionate harm that it causes to the health in their communities, increased illnesses, injuries and deaths from extreme events such as hurricanes and wildfires, and a rise in respiratory diseases caused by degraded air that is further worsened by prolonged drought and wildfires. For example, when activists sued the state of California to block the cap and trade program and engaged in other oppositional tactics, it was not due to their lack of understanding about climate science or policy solutions based on that science. Rather, activists relate to climate change based on their personal experiences and their embodied knowledge. Hence, in California, tensions between climate change worldviews are often centered on the politics of scale, economics, and race. These differences in worldviews, if unacknowledged, can lead to the breakdown of trust, even among groups that are nominally working towards the same goal, reducing the harm that climate change will do to human societies and our planet. Through ethnographic analysis, policy analysis, I highlight how environmental justice activists in California have galvanized behind issues such as air pollution, poverty, and green jobs to advance equitable climate solutions at the local, state, and global levels. For them, climate change is not just about greenhouse gas emissions. Rather, it's also about opposing cultural values and worldviews through which that science about climate change is seen. Moreover, much of this conflict occurred because environmental justice groups were pushing new hypotheses as well as evaluating existing ones around climate problems and solutions. They call for multiple ways of knowing and learning. Through my more than 15 years of research, I observed how environmental justice groups centered their work on telling stories of how their bodies bear the marks of environmental interactions. They frame their work on the human embodiment of climate change and carbon's associated co-pollutants. For them, the body is where points of pollution, social stratification, and poverty intersect. I call this way of knowing and learning as climate embodiment, a concept that draws on ecofeminist studies in the field of public health. For example, environmental justice advocates in Richmond, California, this is in Northern California, and has the largest oil refinery, the Chevron refinery, west of the Mississippi. They argue for a holistic understanding of the links between the infrastructural body, that is the extraction of raw materials for the construction of buildings, to the contaminated human body. In other words, we begin to imagine a form of climate embodiment that represents a continuum, where the human body cannot be divorced from its environment and environmental solutions cannot be isolated from the human body. So what we see in this diagram really goes to the heart of what Ashley was talking about, co-benefits. A lot of analysis focuses on the embodied carbon through different types of processes that we do through fossil fuel consumption. In this case, we look at the construction of buildings through a life cycle analysis from what they call cradle to grave, from extraction of raw materials to building the materials and to end of life. So how much does this process embody? It's embodied with carbon, but environmental justice activists say equally important are the co-pollutants of fossil fuel burning, such as particulate matter, NOx, and SOx, and how these are impacting the human body. So environmental justice really come to climate change and environmental justice issues about how their bodies are impacted, how their children's bodies are impacted by asthma and other types of respiratory diseases, and how this is also reflected in the neighborhoods and the houses and communities they are living in. So together they look towards this embodied perspective of policymaking and really valuing their local experience and knowledge of how do we deal with climate change. Since 2002, this conflict and collaboration of climate change has yielded efforts to link economic opportunity and climate work in the state's most disadvantaged communities of color. This included pairing the state's climate mitigation goals to a series of environmental justice bills which focused on transparency, accountability, public health, and equity in California's climate policy implementation. One such bill, AB 197, requires California's climate policy be implemented equitably with a focus on reducing local and global emissions in our most polluted communities. Another is SB 535, requires that as the state raises funds from climate polluters, it invests a minimum of 35% of those dollars in projects benefited California's disadvantaged and low-income communities of color. This has resulted in over $2 billion in investments in such communities. Most of the state's disadvantaged communities are communities of color and agriculture communities of the San Joaquin Valley, the migrant working communities of the Coachella Valley, and the urban and industrial areas of Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay Area. While the context and impacts encountered in these neighborhoods are different, they also share many similarities to the burdens residents in other parts of the country are facing, places like West Virginia, rural Louisiana, and the Panhandle of Florida, or even in the global South. The work in California illustrates that the inequities of climate change often overlap with the racial, economic, and historical inequities in American society. Through my many years of research, I came to see this tension between different worldviews of climate change, those of mainstream environmentalists and scientists and policymakers, and those of environmental justice advocates. While the worldviews are not absolute, they are a generalization of the dynamics I initially observed within California between the years of 2006 and 2012. In the first worldview, I generally saw one based on utilitarianism, efforts to develop climate policy for the greatest good for the greatest number. I call this worldview carbon reductionism, an adherence to cost effectiveness and market-based solutions focused only on reducing global greenhouse gas emissions without social equity and local health considerations for the most polluted communities. Under this worldview, my research generally observed governments being judged whether their policies are cost effective and benefit the majority. So as we see under the left-hand side of this diagram, carbon reductionism, there's a strong emphasis on greenhouse gas emission reduction. And this is often done through tons of CO2 equivalent, because carbon is the most abundant greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere. And there's a strong scientific framing and detached expertise of who can contribute knowledge about defining the problem of climate change and its corresponding solutions. And there's also an emphasis on cost effectiveness. How can we reduce carbon emissions most cost effectively without having a major shock to our economy and society? And this is often done through market-based solutions such as cap and trade. California has the largest cap and trade system in the world, well, the third largest in the world after the European Union and China. And this cap and trade system is seen as being geographically neutral. Since carbon emissions are global, they mix uniformly in the global atmosphere, they have no human health impacts. So it doesn't matter where you reduce carbon emissions because they're global. You can reduce all your emissions in a wealthy community such as Beverly Hills, or you can do them all in communities such as Compton or Richmond, California. It really doesn't matter as long as you reach that global target. So under carbon reductionism in the early years of California's climate policy, only focus on mitigation and not on adaptation and the impacts that climate change is happening, such as heat waves, droughts, and wildfires. Conversely, on the right-hand side, environmental justice groups generally had a moral rights-based worldview. I dubbed their worldview climate change from the streets, a critical reevaluation of both the practice and politics of reducing carbon emissions. Their worldview considers social equity and argues that a utilitarianism approach ignores distinctions between people, places, and the disproportionate impact of climate change on low-income communities of color. My research observed the environmental justice worldview as participatory, embodied, and experimental. So under this worldview, it considers some of the issues that Ashley was talking about, co-benefits potential. Of course, it's focused on global greenhouse gases, reducing carbon emissions, but also on local emissions that directly affect people's health. Because quite often, many of the greenhouse gases that are burned through fossil fuel combustion also burn local pollution that creates smog and other human health impacts simultaneously. Not a one-to-one, but most often. So this is a great opportunity. Environmental justice groups argue to not silo our local and global policies, but work in tandem and put the limited amount of dollars and resources and staff time to working on multi-benefit policy. So there's this strong contextual framing around climate change, valuing local expertise and embodied knowledge from people on the front lines living next to these oil refineries and power plants or next to freeways. There's of course an emphasis on cost effectiveness, but it should not happen at the expense of social equity or racial justice. So there's a strong emphasis on community-based solutions, ensuring that the people that are suffering most from climate change are being invested in climate reduction strategies. And so there's a strong multi-scalar approach and idea and thinking about linking the global with the regional and the local and the most impacted communities. And finally, environmental justice in the early years of California's climate policy focused on mitigation, but also pushed for adaptation, particularly in these communities experience heat waves, drought, as well as wildfires and low-income communities of color, and not focusing only on hard assets such as freeways, hospitals, and police stations, but also vulnerable communities that are on the front lines of these climate impacts. You may consider these worldviews as a simple dichotomy or a straw man. However, its use is intended to highlight a critical analysis of the contentious politics of scale, economics, and race, and it helps us as scholars and practitioners understand that the actors involved in climate policy making are often speaking from structural locations that are worlds apart. In 2012, yet, I witnessed a big change in climate policy making. It became more participatory and synergetic. Through a recurring process of conflict and collaboration, a broad range of individuals and organizations are now co-producing what climate change means. Furthermore, worldviews are not fixed and can transform over time. Scientific ideas and beliefs about climate change evolve together with the representations, identities, debates, and institutions that give practical effect and meaning to policies. In other words, the ways in which we conceptualize climate change don't just happen. People are behind our government policies and environmental values, and they can change their mind. For instance, at a 2017 United Nations Climate Conference, the former governor of California, Republican governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, made statements that some traditional environmentalists ascribe to the wrong climate worldview. He insisted that climate action should now focus more on local air pollution and their health effects. Schwarzenegger's 2017 position, however, directly contrasted with his worldview when he held public office. As California's governor, he often impeded efforts to link climate policy with environmental justice and public health. His changing perspective reflects the broader evolution of California's epistemologies of climate change. Through such instances, we can assess the diversification of climate change and politics, tracing how scientific facts about the world are fused with social commitments. So to kind of relate this again to the beginning of my talk of anti-racism and climate change policy, the primary mechanism through which is being used to fight climate change, carbon trading, does not mandate reductions at any specific facility or location. Leaves equity to chance. It does not guarantee reductions in communities with the most pollution. So to promote anti-racist climate policy, environmental justice should be a part of climate change from the outset. Environmental justice should not be left to chance or adjust later. The market or economics should not make equity decisions. They should not be planned and intentional. And what activists often argue, there should be no trickle-down environmental policy. So again, this utilitarian approach, the greatest good for the greatest number, that we're doing great policy that affects the entire society, and eventually that's going to get down to the most polluted communities of color. And activists said no from the outset, that you have to address equity and focus resources on these communities. So to conclude, California's climate policy has created dozens of programs that focus on two key outcomes: multi-purpose policies that reduce global greenhouse gases and local pollution that often occur from the same processes of fossil fuel burning, and also create green jobs in communities that create them, have the most impact. By focusing on economic, public health, and justice outcomes, worldviews can be changed and gain some level of trust from legislators, scientists, and other interest groups representing the state's most conservative and rural areas as well. This provides important lessons to other regions, a need to focus on cultural meanings and values of climate change, and thereby providing outcomes and incentives that connect better to multiple worldviews. So really connecting again climate change to the impact in the communities most affected by climate change, and essentially create climate experiments at the local level with like what's happening in Aspen. I documented extensively about Richmond and Oakland and how these justice-led climate action planning was really seen as successful as a ballot, and eventually was scaled up to other regions of California and eventually implemented in California's state level policies. So this emanated from the local scale, Oakland and Richmond. It was an experiment, people saw it, and then eventually it was scaled up. So it's a great reminder that all these major changes in society didn't happen all at once and without conflict. Eventually, it took a great group of activists and people with vision and putting political pressure to change the system at the local level, and eventually it is scaled up. So thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about the very broad issues about my book. And if you want to learn more about more in depth of these case studies, I encourage you to read my book. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions with Ashley as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, your book has been coming up again and again in conversation around here. So I will second that suggestion that if you haven't yet read this book, that you do so. It's an important conversation right now. And it's the first that I've seen that really brings together the multi-scalar, multi-benefit climate action emphasis. So thank you. What we're going to do now, folks, is we're going to move all of the students, the undergraduates that are joining us this morning, into breakout sessions. And we're going to spend about 10 minutes generating compelling questions to bring back for some Q&A. And if you are moved into a group and you're a speaker or a community member or someone who doesn't want to participate in generating those questions, you will have the option to move back to this central space and wait for us to reconvene just after the top of the hour. So, welcome back, everybody. I acknowledge that that is a pretty brief breakout, but we want to take advantage of the conversation together. So if you didn't get to everyone in your group, that's okay. I'm sure that you were able to generate at least a few questions in that amount of time. So what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to go through each breakout group and have the students that are nominated in each of those groups direct one question to Michael and one question to Ashley. And let's start with Whitney's group. So Whitney, if you could either pose those questions to our speakers or have the students you worked with pose those questions themselves, we'll go from there. And just a reminder that if you are bringing a question to our speakers, you're going to need to unmute.
Thanks, Micah. Our group had some good discussion, so we'll kick it off with Matt, starting with his question.
So my question is kind of posed to both speakers just as a general topic, but I was wondering how we would start like a climate action, not only a climate action plan, but actually put it in place and start having progression towards climate action in communities that aren't as affluent as Aspen and able to take those actions for themselves, or are states and areas that aren't as progressive as California, and places that don't have a rigid history of looking into climate change, areas that have been studying this for a long time. How would we implement or start climate action there?
Great. So we'll leave that open to either of our speakers to jump in on.
Try to find Mike on my screen, but I'm happy to jump in. And I think there are a ton of resources out there. So just from the pure logistics standpoint, like the toolkit that I mentioned, there, when communities call me and say, hey, we just hired a sustainability coordinator, or we just realized we need to do some climate action work, where should we start? I've actually moved away from recommending greenhouse gas reduction inventories or greenhouse gas emissions inventories and formal climate action plans, because as I kind of said in my presentation, that can be a 1 to 2 year long process and pretty expensive. And that's not what we need to be spending time on right now. So I think that there are emissions inventories out there that communities can use to kind of assess their current state and just kind of understand where they're at. And then there's sample climate action plans that communities can take on and make their own. So I think that initial getting started process can be greatly shrunk. But I think what you're really referencing, Matt, is, you know, in Aspen, we can talk about climate change. In California, you can say the words climate change in most communities. What about these places where climate change is a non-starter and it's a really divisive topic? And I really like to push the co-benefits again, and not just equity, but you know, if you get an energy assessment or you do energy efficiency work on your home, that increases the safety and comfort of your home, and then definitely increases the sustainability of your electric bills. And so if you're working with low-income communities, start with cost, start with safety. You know, in 50% of the home energy assessments that we do, we find some safety issue that the homeowner needs to address, whether it's a radon issue or gas leaks or other issues that are in the home that are significant safety issues. So I like to start there, even though I'm in Aspen, where I can talk about climate change. Start with these other benefits, and you know, if the homeowner or the person doing this work doesn't even realize it's a climate benefit, that's okay. They don't need to. We just need them to do the work. So that's kind of the approach I take. Mike?
Yes, thank you, Ashley, for that. I think one of the biggest issue in areas that don't have a climate action plan and limited resources is first getting people buy-in that this is necessary, and creating a stronger messaging about climate change and make it more real. How is climate change real to their everyday lives? And quite often that is through a public health lens of linking how fossil fuel burning is creating global emissions as well as local emissions, and their children may have asthma. So it might be through some frame of that, or the work that they do, the working in some of these different types of areas. So that's one area. And also looking at existing community assets. What are the community organizations in the areas that are working on issues that are related to climate change, but are not explicitly climate change? So I documented in my book of Richmond, California, and Oakland, California, where there's a large majority of Latinos, African Americans, and Asian American communities and peoples in that regions, and looking at how those groups, if they're a housing rights advocacy group, if they're a migrant rights group, how is their work related to climate change, and try to bring more groups under the umbrella of sustainability and climate action.
Mike, I really like that point. I think it's going to be welcomed by a lot of students, because a lot of the students at Western are thinking through what it means to be a good ally. A lot of them come from positions of cultural privilege. And I think part of allyship is amplifying existing efforts from communities of color rather than deciding what these communities need. And it sounds like, you know, in finding those unlikely intersections, they don't have climate in the title of their organization, but finding that link and then supporting it, it sounds like that sort of amplifying practice of allyship.
That's great. Whitney, do you have another question you'd like to bring forward?
We do, and Regina is going to ask that question for us.
Great.
And thank you, Dr. John, for kind of answering my question before I ask it. And I just also want to comment to Mike Mendez. I extremely enjoyed reading the book, and I constantly refer back to it in moments. Great reading. I recommend students to get a hold of your own copy. But my question is probably kind of focused at Mike, especially in communities of color, like in tribal communities, where that conversation hasn't necessarily come forward, or we don't even know if that's a priority in our community. How do we get these kind of conversations started? And we necessarily don't have some of the same resources as other communities do as well, but would like to get a conversation started.
Well, thank you for the comments on my book. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that it's a resources and for you, and I'm able to uplift the stories of these environmental justice activists from various communities of color throughout California, and also the indigenous groups that they're working with in the global South, as there's linkage to California's cap and trade system to Mexico and Brazil. in terms of indigenous communities and other communities with less resources, again, it's about that framing issue. How do we make this real? How do we do a public health lens? Other issues have been about an economic issue of indigenous communities. The Yurok tribe, which is the largest indigenous tribe in California, has historically been outside the electrical grid, unable to be connected there. So acknowledging the historic disinvestment, as well as how can we bring in more renewable sources to these areas, and how that is a climate imperative, not just an infrastructure issue, or economic issue, but how is that also related to climate change? And again, making people more aware. And from what I've seen in even one I'm more familiar, rural towns, small rural towns and agricultural regions of California, is, you know, these organizations talking to each other and building up scale and capacity and networking and speaking with the residents and having, particularly with the Latino community platicas, which are community talks about these issues, where people can really talk about their lived experience of how maybe their environmental conditions, their occupational health conditions are all related to an environmental protection paradigm. So acknowledging that the environment is in our own backyard, and having these community talks and leading with these people to allow them to speak for themselves, and, you know, and being able to make those connections to these larger movements as well. But once you have that, I think that's where political pressure is much needed. Once you can build that, sort of that solidify a little bit more, consolidate a little bit more groups, and you can consolidate a little bit more political power and advocate more strongly for to policymakers to direct resources to your area.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone in Whitney's group. For the sake of time, we're going to move on to Jesse Bryan's group. Jesse, would you like to take us from here?
Yeah, we had some good discussion. That went really quick. But Mabel had a question that she would like to ask.
So my question isn't really specific to either of the speakers. Basically, my question is, how can we bring diverse groups and diversity into already established organizations that are environmentally based and have an environmental influence to promote a more inclusive environmental community, basically?
Excellent question. Thank you, Mabel. We'll let either of you run with that.
I guess I'll take a stab. This is something that Aspen is really struggling with right now, because we have a lot of existing environmental organizations that need to be successful, truly need to be broken down and rebuilt so that we can have the diversity in those organizations and groups that we really need to see. But of course, you can't just dismantle 4 or 5 20-year nonprofits and start from the beginning. So how do we get that inclusion and diversity while still moving forward with existing organizations? So that's your question, right, Mabel? And so I would lean back on what Mike said, which is, I don't think that we necessarily need to rebuild and restart from the beginning. We need to recognize that there are existing organizations in other fields and then partner together. So in the Roaring Fork Valley, there's a new organization called Voces Unidos de las Montañas, and their real focus is to get Latinx community members on elected boards throughout the valley. And so their mission is very different than my mission, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't work together. So I don't need to be all things to everybody, and they don't need to be all things to everybody. But if we can recognize that there's a collective impact in our shared missions and work more together, then we can make sure that the representatives that they get on elected boards are also trained in climate action, or vice versa. If we're getting folks on elected boards, we can make sure that they're representative of the community and are aware of equity and diversity issues. So I think you can't you can't just dismantle everything, even though that's what we really need to do. So the feasibility of that is just fine. There are existing organizations doing the work that we need, and there needs to be a meaningful, significant partnership and a transparent partnership between us and them, or between existing organizations. It's not an us and them situation, but so that's what I'm really wrestling with. But Mike, I mean, I look to you to some of the practicality of what that looks like, because it's relationship building.
Yes, I think it's a relationship building thing. Again, consolidating in power. You know, looking at what are the community assets. Not thinking of a community deficits, but starting your analysis, starting your campaign from a community assets approach of what can be built up and leveraged to advocate for more climate action and more representation. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned representation on boards and commissions. And that's another key aspect, is particularly in our environmental protection paradigms and these boards and commissions that yield a lot of power about how our environment is protected and who's deemed to be worthy of protection. So getting people on these boards to ensure that we have more women, we have more people of color, we have a diverse group of individuals that are able to understand the unique issues that are happening in communities of color, particularly low-income communities of color. So I think that's one aspect as well. And then historically, we have seen this in mainstream environmental groups and civil society, NRDC, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy have traditionally been struggling for the last 30 or so years of diversifying their staff, their boards, and the work that they do. But we also have to be careful of having, particularly with traditional big green environmental groups that are often coming into communities and supplanting existing environmental groups of environmental justice groups and color, and duplicating efforts, and also taking away key resources. So now NRDC and a couple others, maybe a couple years ago, they've been called out on this. We're going to the big foundations and taking millions of dollars for equity initiatives. And these environmental justice groups in New York, LA, San Francisco, and throughout the country were never able to compete with these big environmental justice or equity grants. So that's another drawback to including equity and inclusion. So groups have to be speaking to each other and really being able to talk to one another and work in collaboration rather than duplicating or supplanting efforts.
Great. Jesse, do you have another student who'd like to ask a
Yes.
question?
Reagan would like to ask her question.
All right, thank you, Reagan.
Sweet. So Ashley, I know in the beginning you kind of introduced yourself and talked about how you weren't the right person to talk about diversity. And I think that's kind of a struggle with a lot of students, just like, how can we be more inclusive in our language, and how can we actually communicate with people of color using the right terms? And so I think that's one of the most important things, like when trying to be more inclusive, like in this whole climate change and everyday life. And so it's kind of a general question for everyone, but like, if anyone has any resources, whether it's a book that you just like were really inspired by, or like a website or anything, like I think that would be super great just for a ton of students. Yeah.
Sure, great. A new book that I'm currently reading, a lot of friends have, non-academics actually have recommended this book, and I'm probably going to use it in my new environmental class, is How to Be an Anti-Racist. So it's geared towards more the general audience and really looks at how public policy in itself is racist and what can we do to recenter ourselves as individuals, as groups, to be understand more explicitly and engage in these structural inequalities from the outset. So that's one book that's really contemporary that you may be interested in. It's an easy read and it's really cheap on Amazon. I think it was like $14.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, so I'm pursuing a master's degree from UC Denver at the same time in a master's of public administration. And so I'm living in the local government world, but also dabbling in academia as well. And I think that you have to go to these other sectors and understand the language they're using. So if all you do is read academic books about race, or if all I do is read or watch local government, things that are intended for a local government audience, or the private business is only focused on the private business narrative around this topic, then we will remain siloed and we won't have a diverse language to address this. So I think it's really important to seek out the resources. Like Mike mentioned, he's going to use a non-academic book in his class, and I think that's really good. And I need to seek out academic resources instead of just local government resources, because we're all using a slightly different language and getting slightly different information. And I think if you can combine all of those, then you can build a really solid understanding and language on how to speak to these issues. I'll put in the chat a link to I mentioned the USDN resource, so the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. They have a 6-part series on including equity in local government. And I'll drop that in. It's available publicly. It's just like 10-minute videos. And you can see how local government entities are talking about race and equity. And then go to, there's probably some resources on how businesses are talking about equity. And I think just understanding that really wide narrative, and what's stuck with me so much is that I need to rely on myself to become educated on this, because it is not up to those who have been disenfranchised and treated unequitably to tell their story to me and educate me. It is up to me to really, to put the burden on myself to learn that. And so I think that's what we hear most from local government employees is, well, I need somebody who's actually experienced this to come and tell me about it because I don't understand it. And that burden is not on people of color to tell us about their experience. It is on us to learn about others' experience and then understand what we can do about it.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, like, if you want a little bit a wonky kind of analysis of from a practitioner's perspective of how you deal with environmental justice and climate action planning and general plans, the Office of Planning and Research, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research for California has a new guidelines for incorporating environmental justice and land use plans and climate action plans. It comes out of a bill that mandated the inclusion of environmental justice in these plans. It was SB 1000, and it provides sort of guidelines for local governments of how do you integrate this into your local land use plans. So that could be, if you want a very policy wonky perspective, I encourage you to look at that.
Did you put that in the chat?
Yes, I'll find it.
Thanks.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Well, thank you to everyone in Jesse's group. That's really good. I think we're going to go with my group next because it builds on some of the conversation that's happening right now. I would invite one of our faculty, Kate Clark, to pose a question.
Hi, folks. Thank you so much for 2 excellent presentations. I've really enjoyed the questions too, and I think they built to this last one. Dr. Mendez, I want to offer a kind and friendly criticism that came up in our conversation. And I want to just note that I recognize that I'm speaking from a position of white privilege here. But I'm hearing the advice that those of us that are white ought to use our privilege to speak for and bring up issues that don't have that form of privilege. So some folks in our group were troubled by your use, Dr. Mendez, of the term Blacks, as opposed, for instance, to Black people or Black folks. So utilizing this word as a noun and not an adjective. So I wanted to share that feedback, again, a friendly and a supportive way. And I welcome your feedback and how you might consider language or any other insights you have.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for giving me the heads up in the chat that you were going to ask that question. I really appreciate this. And as Ashley mentioned, we're all learning as a person of color, as a gay man person of color. I lived and breathed these issues of environmental justice, racial injustice, homophobia. So I thank you for bringing that. I'll be more aware of that, and I encourage everyone to also be aware as you're speaking to different communities. If I'm speaking to a different community, I may sometimes use Latinx. I come from a different generation where we use Latino or Chicano. So these constructions of identity are changing as groups assert different forms of identity. So it's important to be up to date. So I thank you for that.
Thank you so
Excellent.
much.
Thank you for addressing that. Well, we have another question from our group. I would invite Emma McClure to pose your question, please.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for both of the presentations. Were really informative. Mine is pretty nebulous. I was just curious, and you might just say you should read my book. But like, what kinds of actions are you taking to bring that climate change from the streets and involve those marginalized communities that you mentioned?
So I had a brief slide of some of the achievements that they have done. A lot of this has been legislatively and through local policy as well. At the local policy, we talk about how in the early years, it's really focusing on co-benefits and social justice. And Oakland was one of the first cities in the entire country. I think it was the first in the entire country that linked affordable housing as a climate mitigation strategy, acknowledging that low-income people of color have a much smaller footprint, and they're more likely dependent on or use public transportation. Therefore, their footprint in the region is much smaller than a higher income group. And one of the strategies for climate mitigation often is creating these transit-oriented development, encouraging people to get away from their cars and use public transit, to live near public transit. So a lot of these TODs, transit-oriented development projects, are being developed throughout California, throughout the country, and they're going into very dense, older communities, primarily low-income communities of color, and creating these new development projects, taking away the housing stock that would have affordable rents, and pushing out these people that have a much smaller carbon footprint to the outer regions of San Francisco area, thereby sort of doing a shell game of mitigation strategies. So you may have reduced carbon emissions in Oakland, but you have increased it regionally because people are more car dependent that were public transportation dependent before. And so what they did is advocate and create various studies. These environmental justice groups teamed up with housing right advocates and created models to show that the differences between income groups and the need to preserve affordable housing within Oakland was necessary. So that was one of the key things, is that providing funding and acknowledgement of affordable housing as a key issue. And then these same advocates that were working in Oakland were simultaneously working in Sacramento, in the state capital, and took those lessons learned from Oakland and got that finally implemented in California. So that revenue that comes from cap and trade, I mentioned $2 billion, have been redistributed back to environmental justice communities, and a portion of that is for affordable housing around transit. So preserving these communities or creating also new projects that weren't there before. So that's one of the key issues.
Great. That's a really excellent specific example of feedbacks into the community. Thank you. All right. So we're going to go just a couple minutes over, but I want to honor Lizzie Bauer's group and make sure that those last questions get asked. So Lizzie, take it away.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the conversation that came out of our group. We really struggled with some deep topics, and we nominated Tess to ask a question.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and it's going to work out well for the sake of time because we just have one question that we wanted to pose to both speakers. So we wanted to ask, in fighting for climate justice, how can we strike a balance between the righteous anger that fuels the fight and the peace, or the chilling out, as Winona LaDuke put it, that fosters the unity and thoughtfulness in the movement?
That's a great question. I always start my research or my perspective from a position of hope and empowerment. Again, as I mentioned before, of that community assets building, looking at the community assets instead of the community deficits. Of course, acknowledging that these people, these communities are historically disproportionately impacted by climate change, but also looking at what are the assets that can we build up to create change. And my book, really focuses on a hopeful type of ability of these environmental justice communities to speak for themselves, to change and demand to be at the table and make some of these changes. So I don't like to focus on the gloom and doom and scare tactics, because I think that oftentimes tunes out people. And so I rather like to focus, and what I've seen the most successful framing around climate change is focusing again on how this is going to improve people's lives. And yeah, there's an imperative, a climate emergency is happening, but also focusing on this is a unique opportunity to increase the community well-being of the most impacted communities.
Great. Ashley, would you like to address
It
this?
took me just a moment to unmute there. I'm back.
Sure, no problem.
I would quote one of my favorite authors, Adrienne Marie Brown, who does social justice work in the Midwest. And she says, move at the speed of trust. And I think that that's so critical in local government work. And it runs counter to our intuition working on climate change, because we feel that this is a pressing issue and we must act now, we must go quickly. And especially in political cycles and with our elected officials, our city council is only there for 2 years. And so they want to accomplish all these grand things. But if we are not moving at the speed of trust, which means slowing down, building relationships, and then individually working on this in those relationships, then, and that curve starts slow. It seems like, oh, I'm not getting anywhere. But then once you build trust, you're off and running and you can accomplish more than you ever dreamed possible. So that's kind of what guides me every day when I especially feel this deep need to move really quickly. This is one of the most pressing issues of our time. We must do something about climate change right now. And then I try and slow myself down and say, but we're not going to get anywhere if I don't have that trust to start. I would just say move at the speed of trust.
That's a great comment, actually, speed of trust. I think that's very important, because a subtitle of the book is conflict and collaboration. And a portion of that conflict really happened because of the speed of climate policy that particularly mainstream environmental groups and environmental leaders were trying to push through without taking the time to build relationships with these communities. And in the end, that really cost even more time because there was no trust, and it held up.
Great. Well, I want to personally thank everyone who got involved in this conversation today and posed a question. This conversation is important. We hope you will take it into your classrooms, into your circles of peers, out into the world. Certainly today's conversation has added a new and important dimension to the history of important conversations happening with the Headwaters Conference. And it's been a privilege to be involved. And I just want to thank everyone who showed up this morning. But let's finish by thanking our speakers, of course. So if you would all unmute just for a few seconds and give them a... All right. What a privilege, Michael and Ashley. Thank you so much for enriching our dialogue here at Western and in the Headwaters Conference. And we hope to have you back in some form or another in the future. And we, of course, look forward to seeing what your personal next steps are, because you're doing great work, and we hope that you'll keep in touch about where your career takes you next. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to John, who's going to tell us about the rest of our morning.
Great.
I wanted to say thank you to everybody. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope the rest of the day goes really well.
Yeah, and Ashley, that was great. I think you gifted us with a phrase that's going to be one of those, at any good conference, certain phrases just getting uttered over and over again. And so do an internet search for speed of trust at the end of the day. Speed of trust Headwaters. You'll probably see people are already blogging about it. Thank you for that. And Dr. Mendez, I see a lot of people commenting they're excited to read your book, and just so grateful. You've already done so much for our community, and love having you in this conversation. And Micah, everybody, Dr. Micah Russell is going to be next year's Headwaters director, and he already has some cool ideas for that. So this is a nice little introduction him to the community.